Yes. Actually, this is what, not in the current charter, but as we said, we encourage people to come up in the front to discuss that. And by discussing that, will develop to become the, potential work item when we, try to reach out to this working group. Okay. But before we, we get rechartered, we are not going to adopt it. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so this is Jefferson speaking. Next slide. I'm going to present the main updates of this draft. It's about the format and of the autonomic intention. So the main updates is the addition of some sections on the concept of intent, and also some use case. And also there is the division in two classes of intents. The first one is high-level policy intent and the network level parameter intent, which I'm going to discuss later on the presentation. And also there are some new sections which are still in to be defined mode, but we expect to have some tests for these sections sooner. Next slide. So as described in the reference model, the intent is an abstract high-level policy used to operate a network. So this is the direct words. And this is the difference of this and the traditional network management system method is that's not necessary to configure each node directly. So the drive for the inclusion in this version of the draft is whether we should consider the use case in which is previously presented as an intent. So this use case, which describes prefix lengths for IP run, should be assigned an intent, and this is directly written on draft, and also Sheng presented this earlier. So next slide. In the current version of our draft, this is yes, this is an intent. And what we have to ask ourselves is, if this is not an intent, we probably need another source, another format of configuration information in order to do that. So studying this use case, we came to the conclusion that probably would be good to have two kinds of two classes of intent, which are high-level policy intents and the network level parameter intents. So they are mostly two different abstraction levels for intents, but this separation in different kinds also brings some questions. The first question, which I pointed earlier, is there is any configuration parameter of an ANIMA network outside intents? This is the first open question. The second question is, there are different kind of intents, and I think in the previous meeting, we also talked about some different kinds. So I think this is probably the main question of our draft right now. It's something like we want to divide intents in different classes, levels, abstractions, and all this kind of classification. And now this also leads for some kind of a hierarchy of intents. Next slide. So talking about the use case we added in the draft, the first one talks about an autonomic network, probably ANIMA network of some operator, which has autonomic function agents for performing load balancing in the network. So in this use case, we have the definition of some configuration information about this load balancing. And for example, the operator can define that for some part of the network, for example, the metropolitan part of the network, we have some kind of load balancing. And for the core network, we can have another level of load balancing. And also probably the intent must be interpreted to come to the conclusion which is each part of the network. Next slide. The second use case, which is also a high-level policy intent example, is how to arrange some VM gas distribution in a network. So in this example, we have a network that can monitor some information like CPU and power utilization. It's kind of a green computing example, and can also control the status of each host machine. So, for example, the operator can have some kind of intent which states something like you have to keep the CPU utilization to some extent, for example, 70% or something like this, or you can have the least number, the smaller number of VM activated in a given time, and it's kind of configuration. Next slide. So, switching to network level parameter intent examples, which are lower level, as we can say, examples. So the use case 3 is when you have the bootstrapping of a new device, it's necessary some kind of information, some information to enable this bootstrapping. So maybe, for example, to reduce the complexity of bootstrapping, they perhaps not to be encrypted. And they can be treated in an expression case of intent, which is the bootstrap intent. So again, we're talking about some classification of intents. Next slide. The fourth use case, which is also a network level parameter intent example. Assuming you can have an autonomic network and connect to internet. So you need an IP prefix for the whole autonomic domain in that area for this operator. So device in this example can configure themselves after the human operator notify the IP prefix for this domain. And in order to have the configuration for each device in the network, we need this information from the prefix to give given the individual addresses. Next slide. The fifth case, also a network level parameter example, is, for example, you can have you need to configure the routing protocol in autonomic domain, and there are some choices like which kind of a protocol, routing protocol do you want to use in that domain. Slide. The sixth use case, I don't need to describe again, is the use case that Cheng described earlier in this meeting. Next slide. So, comparing these two kinds of intents, the high-level policy intent and the network-level parameter intent, the first one can have, for example, multiple autonomic function agents related to this intent. Probably it will be necessary some interpretation by a policy continuum interpreter in order to have this high-level policy information translated to lower level device commands. And also the way that this translation should be done, it's out of the scope of this charter. On the other hand, we have the network level parameter intent, and this is more like it's closer to individual commands that are necessary to configure each device in the network. So this is mostly for establishing the network infrastructure. And also, we think that this is more stable intents since after the network is configured in the same way, it's not necessary to change this frequently. And also coordination is not necessary most of times considering these lower level intents. So it's also a division in terms of complexity of each class. Next slide. The ANIMA first focus is the interpretable and implementable intent, at least as this is what is being discussed in the meetings. And obviously, the network level parameter intent is simpler to be realized because it's closer to the device. You don't have some complexity of translation. And also we include in the draft some related topics that we think it's important to be discussed on the context of this working group. The first one is the distribution of autonomic network intent, which is kind of what the previous presentation, no, not the previous, the version by Bing was about. How to interpret the intent, so in which way each autonomic function agent will interpret the information from intent to come to the individual commands to configure the network, and also how to manage the autonomic network intents. So, for example, you have triggers and intents generates how you can come to a conclusion. For example, for updates, and this kind of operation, the life cycle of the intents. Slide.
Can I just make a comment as a working group chair? So this is all cool, but you know, the one thing I'd like to see from people thinking about intent as a working group chair is, well, we've been thinking about intent and we've come to the conclusion that, for example, what we're doing right now with GRASP is necessary and sufficient to build an intent system on top of it, or no, we're missing some things, or you know, here are the things we don't really need, right? So that we basically have a tie-in of the people thinking about the next phase into, you know, the validity of what we're trying to, you know.
You mean like the requirements?
Yeah, requirements, basically it's necessary, it's sufficient. That would be cool, right? If we had an outcome like that. Or for example, no,